In this workflow tutorial, I'll show you how to set up a 3D corner pin and add reflections in After Effects 2026. Let's get started. So I've loaded my footage in my composition, and I'll run a detailed analysis in After Effects' 3D camera tracker. Once it's finished, I'll select the trackers that represent the screen that we want to replace, and then I'll right-click and click Create Solid and Camera. Now we've got our monitor track and our camera, and if you're able to solve the light source that's going to be reflecting in the screen, you should solve that too. Unfortunately, in this case, it's not going to be accurate because the light source is partially visible and behind reflections and smudges. We can't help that, so we'll worry about that later. Let's focus on our screen. I want to align my 3D layer with my monitor. It's already aligned with the plane, but let's just adjust the Z rotation to match the angle. And instead of using the scale to match the size, I'll use the solid source resolution in the layer settings. While I'm here, I'll rename it to monitor. So align it as close as you can to the edge of the screen, and you can use the anchor point to center it a bit more. Now this size that we ended up with is really big. Our composition is only 4K, so our screen definitely doesn't need to be 5K. Another indicator of the scene's scale is how far your camera travels. So in this case, it's traveling 13,000 pixels, and that's a lot. Fortunately, it's really easy to position and scale the scene ourselves. To do that, I'm going to parent the camera to the monitor layer. Now the camera moves with the monitor layer. So if I reset the monitor's transform properties, the camera moves with it in 3D space. That's why we don't see any changes in the camera's view. Now in my case, because the monitor is tilted back like this, I'll want to keep the orientation. So I'll leave those values and reset the rest. So now it's positioned correctly, but we want to scale it as well. Let's go with 50%. Then when I unparent my camera, it now travels 50% of the distance that it used to travel. The only thing left is that our monitor's layer scale is still 50% and the source resolution is still 5K. To fix that, we can multiply the width and height by 0.5 or 50%, and then set the scale back to 100%. And now everything's uniform. Next, I'll add a corner pin effect on the monitor and line up the corners on a frame where I can clearly see them. I'll pre-comp this layer and leave the corner pin outside of it. And then inside the comp, I'll make the solid black. And then I'll add a checkerboard effect to help visually. Now anything I add inside the monitor comp will be reflected in our main composition at a reasonable size and at the correct aspect ratio. Alright, our 3D solid can't reflect light, so we're going to use a layer type that's new in After Effects 2026, and that's the 3D plane. As soon as you create it, After Effects will alert you that the composition's renderer is going to be changed to Advanced 3D. And that means that in our comp settings, the 3D renderer has been set to Advanced 3D instead of Classic 3D, which enables all of these features and disables all of these features. But we'll look at some workarounds for this in a little bit, specifically for blending modes and track mats. Back in the composition, we now have a 3D plane. Let's copy our 3D solids position and rotations over to the 3D plane so that they're exactly aligned. To extend the 3D plane, go down to Mesh Options in the Properties panel and adjust the width and the height. I'll make it a bit bigger than the screen comp because I'll eventually use that screen comp as a mat. Okay, so what we're seeing here has nothing to do with reflections. It's called Z-fighting, and it's happening because our layers are in the same place in 3D space, and After Effects doesn't know which one to render first. For now, let's just disable our monitor layer while we look at the 3D plane. This doesn't look like much, and that's because we don't have anything to reflect. So let's create a point light. And now we can see the reflection of the light. And we can position this anywhere we want. In my case, I need to place the light in the computer case. And to get a precise position, I'm going to quickly use a script called Tracker Solver. Full disclosure, I created Tracker Solver, which you can get on AE Scripts, but I created it exactly for this type of scenario, so obviously I'm going to use it. It's very simple. You create a 2D null, then I'll give it a few keyframes of the point I want to solve, and then click Solve to generate a 3D null in the target position. Then I can grab that 3D position and paste it onto my light. And now it matches the motion, just like the original reflections. I no longer need the 2D and 3D tracker, so I can delete those, and I can close Tracker Solver. I mentioned that we'd be looking at workarounds for blending modes and track mats, which aren't available on our 3D plane. In order to use those, we'll have to pre-compose our reflections into their own composition. And for that, I'll need a copy of my light and my camera, so I'll duplicate those. And I'll pre-compose the new camera, the new light, and the 3D plane together. I'll name it Reflections. Now if you solo the Reflections pre-comp, it still moves correctly because inside that pre-comp, we have our camera and our light. Back in our main composition, we can now use our pinned solid as a track mat and set the blending mode to add, or whatever you want. We can also set the renderer back to classic 3D since we're not using 3D geometry in this composition anymore. So while the Reflections pre-comp is still advanced 3D, it sits in a classic 3D composition as a 2D layer. Okay, let's work on our reflections a little bit in the Reflections pre-comp. First, we're going to want a copy of our media so that we can see what we're doing, but I'll set it to be a guide layer so that it doesn't render in our main composition. The other thing I'll do is temporarily scale the plane down so that we can see the edges that we're matching to. To customize the reflection, you'll be looking at the plane's material section at the bottom of the Properties panel, as well as the light's intensity and color. Let's start with keyframing the light's color to match the source. And then let's mess around with the material settings. The material we're using is the default one, but you can browse Adobe's community assets to download one that works for your project. Once it's imported in your project, it'll be listed in this dropdown, and then each material has its own properties to mess around with. But for this, we'll just use the default. It'll work just fine for our purposes. The first setting is our base color, which is the surface color of the material before the light hits it. The roughness is how sharp or soft our reflections are. Metallic is how metallic our surface is, where the more metallic it is, the reflections become stronger and they also become tinted by the base color. The emission color sets the color of the light that the material emits, and the emission intensity controls how strong that emission is, which is basically self-illumination. And then ambient response, which is how much it responds to ambient lighting. So if there's an ambient light in the scene or you're using image-based lighting, that would be controlled here. And we don't have anything like that, so we don't see any change. The reflection actually looks pretty good at the default, so I'm actually going to leave them as default right now. You're going to be customizing it for your project anyway. But also another way that we can customize that reflection is to add effects to the reflections layer in our main composition, like adding levels, for example. And this is where we could also add blurs and grain to mitigate any banding that might be occurring in the gradients. Speaking of gradients, if I look at the original media again, there's a gradient falling off at the bottom of the screen. That's coming from the light shining on the motherboard, and then the illuminated motherboard is reflecting back into the screen. We won't be able to get that effect using a single point light. And instead of adding more lights or different lights in my reflections composition, I'm going to make another instance of my reflections in my main comp and treat the soft gradient reflections separately from the sharp ones. And this is pretty easy to do with the drag and replace function. I'll first reveal the source. I'll duplicate the reflections source, and then I'll name them soft and sharp. And then I'll duplicate the reflections layer, and then with one of them selected, I can drag and replace with my new source. And now we have two unique compositions for each part of the reflection. In the soft reflections composition, I'll lower the light a little bit, and then I'll change my settings to soften it. And then we can adjust our levels in the main comp as well. Okay, you get the idea. We can fully customize our glare on the screen. One last thing I want to mention, since we're working with a 3D screen, we can use depth of field. When I analyze the footage, I can see that the focus at around frame 120 appears to be in the middle of the keyboard. I'll flip back over to 2 views again, and under my camera options, I'll enable depth of field. Now I can customize the distance of my depth plane, so I'll set it to be in the middle of my monitor. And then the aperture controls the intensity of the depth of field effect. Depth of field is one of the features that's disabled in the advanced 3D renderer at the time of making this video, but it's already available in the beta version, so we can expect it in the coming updates. And that's it. I hope this gave you a solid head start on any 3D tracked corner pins and reflections you might be facing. Now you can composite your screen like you normally would and customize your reflections the way that you want them. Thanks for watching.